June 21st, 1941. Along the long frontier between Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the night is unusually quiet. German soldiers wait in darkness beside rows of artillery. Tanks sit concealed beneath camouflage nets. Engines are silent. Radios are quiet. Orders have already been issued, sealed, and distributed. More than 3 million men stand ready along a front nearly 2,900 kilometers long. Across the border, Soviet soldiers sleep in their barracks. Many believe the German army is still bound by the Non-Aggression Pact signed 2 years earlier. In the early hours before dawn, the silence begins to break. At 3:15 in the morning, the guns open fire. What follows will become the largest land invasion in human history. By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany appeared unstoppable. In less than 2 years, Adolf Hitler's military machine had conquered most of Europe. Poland had collapsed in weeks. Denmark and Norway had fallen in a matter of days. France, considered one of Europe's strongest military powers, had surrendered. After only 6 weeks of fighting in 1940, Western Europe was now largely under German control. Yet Hitler's strategic vision extended far beyond the Atlantic coast. For years, he had spoken openly about his belief that Germany needed living space in the East. In his ideology, the vast lands of the Soviet Union were both a resource and a target. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939 had been a temporary arrangement. Both regimes understood it was unlikely to last. In the winter of 1940 and early 1941, German planners began preparing for a massive offensive against the Soviet Union. The operation received a code name, Operation Barbarossa. The scale of the planned invasion was unprecedented. The German High Command assembled 3 massive army groups for the assault. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would push through Belarus toward Moscow. Army Group South would advance into Ukraine, targeting the agricultural and industrial resources of the region. In total, approximately 3.3 million German soldiers were committed to the initial attack. They were supported by nearly 600,000 vehicles and more than 600,000 horses used for transport and artillery movement. The armored spearheads included roughly 3,300 tanks. Overhead, the German Air Force deployed around 2,700 aircraft to provide air superiority and close support. Alongside the German forces were additional units from Romania, Finland, Hungary, and Italy. The front line stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Never before had a single military operation covered such distance, manpower, and logistical complexity. German planners believed the Soviet Union could be defeated within a matter of months. The campaign plan depended on speed. The German army had already demonstrated its doctrine of fast, coordinated warfare, later called Blitzkrieg, during the invasions of Poland and France. Armored divisions would break through enemy lines, advance rapidly into the rear, and encircle entire armies. The Soviet Union, they believed, would collapse once its Western armies were destroyed. German intelligence significantly underestimated Soviet manpower reserves and industrial capacity. The initial phase of the invasion followed the familiar pattern of rapid mechanized assault. At dawn on June 22nd, German aircraft struck Soviet airfields across the western frontier. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground during all the first hours. Simultaneously, German artillery and armored units began crossing the border. The Soviet command structure was thrown into confusion. Joseph Stalin had received numerous warnings of a possible invasion in the months before the attack, but he believed Germany would avoid opening a second front while still fighting Britain. As a result, Soviet forces were not fully mobilized. Many units were caught unprepared. Within days, German armored columns pushed deep into Soviet territory. In the north, Army Group North advanced rapidly through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. In the center, Army Group Center launched a massive pincer movement around Soviet forces in Belarus. Near the city of Minsk, German armored divisions completed one of the largest encirclements of the war. By early July 1941, approximately $300,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured. The advance continued eastward. Further encirclements followed near Smolensk, capturing another 300,000 Soviet troops. In the south, Army Group South encountered stronger resistance, but still pushed steadily into Ukraine. German commanders reported extraordinary battlefield success. Within the first 3 weeks of the invasion, German forces had advanced up to 500 kilometers in some sectors. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. By September 1941, German reports estimated that more than 2 million Soviet soldiers had been captured. However, the deeper the German army moved into Soviet territory, the more difficult the campaign became. The distances alone created severe logistical problems. The Soviet Union's vast geography had always been one of its greatest strategic defenses. German supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers behind the advancing front. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food had to travel across damaged roads and poorly maintained railways. Complicating matters further, the Soviet railway system used a wider track gauge than German trains. As a result, German engineers had to convert thousands of kilometers of railway lines before supply trains could reach the front. The summer heat created clouds of dust that clogged engines and damaged equipment. Later in the year, autumn rains turned roads into deep mud. German soldiers referred to this seasonal phenomenon as the Rasputitsa. Armored vehicles often became stuck in thick mud, unable to move forward. Despite the losses suffered during the opening months, the Soviet Union did not collapse. The Soviet government mobilized millions of additional soldiers. Factories located in western Russia were dismantled and transported east beyond the Ural Mountains. Within months, many of these factories resumed production. New tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft began reaching the front in growing numbers. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders gradually adapted their defensive tactics. Instead of allowing entire armies to be surrounded, they began organizing deeper defensive lines. The cost remained enormous. By the end of 1941, Soviet military casualties had reached several million. Yet the German timetable for victory was already slipping. The critical objective for the German High Command remained Moscow. Army Group Center began preparing for the final push towards the Soviet capital in early Fuse. Autumn. The offensive began in October 1941 under the name Operation Typhoon. Initially, the German advance again achieved large encirclements. Near the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk, German forces trapped more than 600,000 Soviet troops. The road to Moscow appeared open, but the campaign was now entering a new phase. Autumn rains slowed the advance to a crawl. Vehicles struggled to move along roads that had turned into deep mud. Temperatures began to drop. By November, winter conditions arrived. German troops had not been issued adequate winter clothing because the campaign had been expected to end before the cold season. Engines froze overnight. Weapons malfunctioned in sub-zero temperatures. Many soldiers suffered frostbite. At the same time, Soviet resistance stiffened. New divisions transferred. From Siberia began arriving near Moscow. These troops had been stationed in the Far East to guard against potential conflict with Japan. Once Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia, these experienced units were redeployed west. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a major counteroffensive along the Moscow front. Fresh Soviet troops pushed against exhausted German units. German forces were driven back from the outskirts of the city. It was the first major strategic setback for the German army during the war. The expectation of a quick victory had disappeared. What had begun as a rapid invasion was turning into a prolonged war of attrition. By the winter of 1941 or 1942, German casualties in the Eastern Campaign had already exceeded 750,000. Soviet losses were far greater. Historians estimate that by early 1942, the Soviet Union had suffered roughly 4 million military casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. Despite the devastation, Soviet production continued to increase. Factories relocated east of the Urals began producing tanks such as the T-34 in large numbers. This tank would become one of the most effective armored vehicles of the war. Meanwhile, German industry struggled to replace equipment lost during the invasion. The war in the East gradually became the central battlefield of World War II. Over the following years, the Eastern Front would consume enormous resources and manpower from both sides. Approximately 80% of German military casualties during the entire war occurred on this front. Entire cities would become battlefields. Leningrad would endure a siege lasting nearly 900 days. Stalingrad would become the site of one of the deadliest urban battles in history. And the vast plains of Russia would witness some of the largest tank battles ever fought. In retrospect, many historians consider the invasion of the Soviet Union to be the strategic turning point of the war. Germany had committed itself to a conflict it was not prepared to sustain. The assumptions that guided Operation Barbarossa, rapid victory, Soviet collapse, limited duration, proved incorrect. The Soviet Union absorbed the initial shock and continued fighting. By opening the Eastern Front, while Britain remained undefeated and the United States increasingly involved in the conflict, Germany found itself fighting a global war against multiple major powers. Years later, military historians examining the IU campaign would highlight several critical factors: underestimation of Soviet resources, logistical overextension, failure to prepare for winter conditions, and the ideological nature of the campaign itself, which led to brutal occupation policies that strengthened Soviet resistance. The invasion that began before dawn on June 22, 1941, did not end in the months German planners had expected. Instead, it opened a conflict that would last nearly 4 years. By the time Soviet forces reached Berlin in May 1945, the war on the Eastern Front had claimed more than 25 million Soviet lives, military and civilian combined. German losses were also immense. Operation Barbarossa began as the largest invasion ever attempted. It ended as one of the most costly campaigns in human history. Today, along the quiet fields that once marked the border between Germany's armies and the Soviet Union, there are few visible signs of the forces that once gathered there. The artillery is gone. The tanks are gone. The soldiers who waited in the darkness that night are long gone. But the decision made in those early hours of June 22, 1941, reshaped the course of the Second World War, and the echoes of that moment continue to define how historians understand the war that followed.